Hi everybody, I'm back. I'm here to give you a little lecture, a quick one, because I'm always quick on these, for World War II on the home front. That's partly the most important thing that we have to learn because the College Board usually asks short answer questions about the home front and less about the war itself in terms of the fighting. So let's go over our key points here about the home front. First of all, the United States was late to the war. So in 1941, Pearl Harbor occurred in December. So, of course, a month later, it's already 1942. So the U.S. fighting forces don't really get going until 1942. The key to the U.S. success in beating the Germans in Europe and the Japanese in the Pacific was production. And so the government spent most of its efforts at trying to recruit people, get materials to the right factories, and win the production war. And that's what won the war for the United States. At one point, of all of the war materials being built by all the different countries that were involved in World War II, the United States was producing 40%. So way beyond what our thoughts originally were when we went into the war. So it was very successful. So let's go through it really quick. The agencies are similar to what happened in World War I. The government established key agencies to help win this war. The most important you'd have to know is the WPB. This is the War Production Board, and this was huge. They were in charge of allocating materials to the factories, getting the oil to the necessary factories and to the machineries that were used for war production, and allocating materials to the West Coast for shipbuilding, to the Midwest for building of planes, and tanks, especially in Ford's plants in Detroit, were all converted to tank production and Jeep production. It's a pretty impressive story. They did an incredible job converting these factories that were idle during the Great Depression into these war-producing factories. In fact, at one point, whereas people were leaving the cities during the Great Depression, there is a labor shortage. Just for instance, Chicago had a 50% unemployment rate during the Great Depression, but when the war hit, within 1 year, there was a labor shortage in Chicago. That's how quickly employment turned around in 1940 and 41. So the War Production Board was key. They put a lot of propaganda out there to get people to join these jobs and join defense working training facilities, getting people to join the effort, especially women. Big impact on women and African Americans during World War II. We'll get to that in a second. The Office of Price Administration, this is the OPA. This is what everybody had to deal with. It was time to do your sacrifice. You had to do your part to win the war and get the war effort to your front door. And this was about rationing. You registered with the Office of Price Administration, and you could not get gasoline. You could not pull into a gas station and start pumping gas unless you had a ration card that said you could get a certain amount of gas. Once your ration card was hole punched for, let's say, gasoline, once you used all your hole punches for the month, you could not get gasoline unless you started trading your coupons with other people in their ration books. So sometimes people would trade butter for gasoline, and different people could get more things depending on how big their family was, or if they had to drive to work and they were a defense plant, you got priority. Other than that, everything was rationed. Even certain foods were rationed: eggs, butter, dairy products. Certain things you couldn't get your hands on at all. Rubber, all that was used for the war effort. Nylon and silk, all used for parachutes and things of that nature. So you couldn't get your hands on that either. So all of that became sacrifices for the American people during this time. And there were huge drives for scrap metal and rubber and other things in every community. The Boy Scouts oftentimes led those things, go from door to door, and people would donate for the war effort. The NWLB, this is the National War Labor Board. This was to solve the problems of strikes. And they passed a new act called the Smith-Connolly Act. And the Smith-Connolly Act essentially gave the government the power to take over industries. If strikes threatened a war industry from actually being able to produce, the government could take it over. And so this was an incentive for unions and workers to make sure they did not strike. It was invoked on a couple of occasions, and some people who did not listen to the authorities and try to break a strike or negotiate a strike, they got in trouble, including Montgomery Ward, or was it Marshall Field? Somebody from Chicago was actually carried out of his office after not complying with a labor board decision. So the government did have expanded powers during the war effort, no doubt about that. There was no Sedition or Espionage Act passed during World War II, however. That was a World War I thing. In World War II, they used different methods to promote loyalty, a lot of propaganda and things of that nature, but we'll see that it's a little different from World War I, not as harsh in certain aspects, but harsher in another one, which we'll talk in a second. The impact on culture and society. Let's talk about this. Is a really important one. This is asked a lot from the AP. Women. The Rosie the Riveter movie that I posted for you guys, you're going to love it. Watch it. It's a classic. So I put it out there. I'm going to put some questions from it as well. These are women who are interviewed a couple of decades after they were volunteering in World War II in their jobs. And different women from different walks of life talk about how it affected their lives. And it's really good. I really recommend you watch it. There's some parts that are really funny and really interesting. But it's very poignant. And some of the stories they tell about what it was like in working for the government and working for these defense jobs, and how they were told that it's for the duration, that you are to go home after this. And the propaganda to get women to come out was insulting in many instances. And watch it and check it out. Many more women joined the workforce during World War II by far, and it would continue after the war. And many people think that this is the generation that will really get involved in what will eventually become the women's rights movement. Many of those women who were young in their 20s and 30s during the 1960s and 70s, their moms worked in these plants and supported their efforts for more equality in the workforce. African Americans, they had the so-called Double V campaign, Double Victory. The V stands for victory. It was to have victory abroad, where they fought in segregated units, by the way. The last war that the United States will fight was segregated units. And the victory at home over racism and discrimination. A. Philip Randolph was a leader who actually threatened a march on Washington in 1943 if Franklin Roosevelt didn't support what's called the Fair Employment Practices Committee. The Fair Employment Practices Committee or Commission was established by Roosevelt eventually after pressure from these groups to maintain equality of payment and wages and treatment in the industries, the defense industries. And it was successful, actually, and it raised wages, and many African Americans came up from the South. The Great Migration increased exponentially in World War II, just like it started in World War I, continued into World War II, and more African Americans start coming to northern cities and western cities, into these shipyards and into these factories to build war materials, and they found higher wages. The one thing they still had a problem with, of course, was segregated housing, and that did not change all that much during World War II. Latinos. Latinos during World War II had a program that was really interesting. It's called the Bracero program. During the Great Depression, many Latinos were actually rounded up and expelled from the country. And that policy completely reversed in World War II. There were buses sent into Mexico to bring in Latino workers to work the fields and the farms that were supplying the troops and Americans with food. Many of these farms were in California in the Southwest. So hundreds of thousands of Latinos came into the United States during World War II. The agreement was you can come work, there's a work permit that you can get, and it will lead to citizenship, and in exchange you will not be drafted, because the draft was instituted very early on in World War II, and there was a concern from Mexico especially that this would be used to draft former Mexican citizens into the U.S. Army. Not the case. Oftentimes, by the way, Latinos who lived in the United States who were already citizens, they were put in segregated units as well during this war and fought bravely overseas. By the way, African American units also highly decorated during World War II, especially there's a movie called Red Tails, and that's about an all African American unit in the Air Force, and they protected bombers. They were a fighter squadron, and they were the most decorated fighter squadron in World War II. Native Americans could get out of the reservations. The poverty had hit the reservations hard during the Great Depression, and Native Americans volunteered within the largest percentage in terms of ethnic groups. Native Americans had the largest percentage of that group that actually volunteered and fought in the Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force. The Marines used Navajo for code, and Navajo native speakers, they were brought into the Marine Corps to actually have coded messages. And of all the codes that all the countries used in World War II, the Navajo code was never broken by the other side. whereas the Americans broke the code of the Germans and broke the code of the Japanese. The British did that as well. Got to give the Brits some credit. Cheerio. For the duration, this became the phrase of World War II, that we just have to sacrifice for long enough to win and do this. And after 2-3 years of fighting in World War II, it was quite the sacrifice. Almost 75,000 workers who were working in defense jobs died from accidents or were permanently disabled as a result of accidents that happened in these very dangerous plants. And there was more people died in the first year of World War II in the home front and factory accidents than actually died in combat. So it was quite the sacrifice for those people who were in those factories at home. Dangerous work. And last thing, one of the most controversial, is the decision by the president to create internment camps. Internment camps included a small amount of Germans who were suspected of being loyal to Nazis were put in camps, and people who were captured overseas were sometimes brought over and put in camps, in prisoner of war camps, places like Texas and the deserts. But it was the Japanese Americans, citizens of this country, were actually ordered, if you lived on the West Coast, then you had to report to internment camps. And over 100,000 Japanese Americans were put in internment camps for the duration of the war. They were not forced labor camps or anything like that. You lived in these barracks basically, and they created their own communities. In some cases, they had their own schools and ran these schools, and had jobs that people did within the communities. And I had a former student. Her family was put in internment camp. Her grandparents, and they had a yearbook that was made. After a couple of years, they got and did these types of things in the camps. But it wasn't fun. Wasn't pretty. And it was a really kind of a sad moment when the government took away those rights from those American citizens. Later on in Korematsu versus the United States, in a lawsuit saying that internment is illegal during wartime, the Supreme Court sided actually with the government and said internment can take place during a time of war. Later, 20 years after that, the Supreme Court reversed itself and said no, internment cannot happen, and especially the fact that property was sometimes seized without compensation. And then way later on, and 40 years later in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, when he was president, apologized for internment. And every Japanese American who had survived the internment camp experience and was still alive in 1980 was given a $10,000 check as an apology. I'm sure that totally erased the stain there. Mm-hmm. So there you go. That's our lecture on how World War II impacted the home front. You can follow along on the PowerPoint if you want to replay this. I'll post the PowerPoint, and it goes pretty much in the same order the slides I have on there, with some more details on the slides. And of course, do your reading. This is probably the last guide, because it looks as though the College Board is going to say this is the last unit before the AP test that they're going to put out. I'll give you more information on that when I know it. Hang in there, everybody. We're in this together.